There is a force inside you that refuses to be still. Not ambition, though it looks like that. Not aggression, though it can feel like that. Not the desire for money or status or control over others, though these are the shadows it casts when it's misunderstood. Friedrich Nietzsche called it the will to power. And he did not mean power over people. He meant power over yourself. The drive to become, to grow, to overcome, to transform suffering into strength, weakness into creation, chaos into meaning. It is the force that pushes the plant through stone, the child through 100 falls before learning to walk, the artist through years of rejection before the breakthrough.
It is life wanting more life. Not survival, not comfort, but expansion, evolution, the refusal to stay small. And Nietzsche believed this force is the deepest truth of existence, that everything, every person, every society, every value system is shaped by it. That those who embrace it become creators, and those who deny it become slaves. But most people deny it. They have been taught to fear their own power, to shrink themselves, to call strength dangerous and weakness virtuous, to believe that power is evil and submission is holy. And so they live diminished lives, resentful lives, lives spent worshiping weakness while secretly hating those who dare to be strong.
And Nietzsche spent his life trying to expose this lie, to show people what they have been taught to fear, that inside you is something wild, something powerful, something that wants to grow. And if you deny it, if you suppress it, if you call it evil, it will turn against you. It will become self-destruction instead of self-overcoming. It will rot inside you, and you will spend your life hating yourself for being weak, while simultaneously believing that weakness is virtue. This is the trap Nietzsche saw everywhere, and it is the trap you are living in right now.
Before we go further, ask yourself this. When was the last time you felt powerful? Not over someone else, not through dominance or control, but powerful in yourself, alive, growing, expanding, creating. When was the last time you felt your will to power, not as aggression, but as becoming? And if you cannot remember, ask yourself why. What taught you to fear your own strength? What convinced you that growing, striving, becoming more than you are, is somehow wrong?
Nietzsche would say, you have been lied to. And the lie has been so thorough, so deeply woven into your culture, your morality, your sense of self, that you mistake it for truth. You mistake weakness for virtue. You mistake stagnation for peace. You mistake submission for humility. And you call your fear of power goodness. But it is not goodness. It is cowardice. And Nietzsche knew this because he lived it. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in a small German village, the son of a Lutheran pastor who died when Nietzsche was only 4 years old.
He grew up in a household of women, his mother, his sister, his grandmother, 2 aunts, and he was raised to be good, obedient, pious, small. The kind of boy who does what he is told, who never makes trouble, who shrinks himself to fit the expectations of others. And he hated it. Not consciously at first, but something in him resisted, something in him refused to be domesticated. And as he grew older, he began to see the trap, that the morality he had been taught, Christian morality, the morality of humility, submission, turning the other cheek, was not about making people better. It was about making them weak.
about teaching them to fear their own strength, about turning life-affirming power into life-denying guilt. He studied theology, then philology. He became a professor at the University of Basel at the age of 24, the youngest ever appointed. He was brilliant, respected, on a path to academic success. And then something broke. He volunteered as a medical orderly in the Franco-Prussian War. He wanted to see war, to test himself, to understand what men were capable of when stripped of civilization's comforting lies. And what he saw devastated him. Not the violence itself, but the suffering. The soldiers, wounded and dying, clinging to life with a ferocity that revealed something primal, something beyond morality. They were not good or evil. They were simply alive, and they wanted to keep living, not out of virtue, out of will. Nietzsche contracted dysentery and diphtheria during the war. He nearly died, and when he returned, something in him had changed. He could no longer believe in the moral systems he had been taught. He could no longer pretend that Christianity's teachings about humility and submission were about love.
He saw them for what they were: tools of control, ways of making people weak so they would not threaten the powerful, ways of turning strength into guilt and weakness into virtue. And so he began to write, not as a scholar, as a prophet, as someone who had seen through the lie and could not stay silent. His first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, was a disaster. His academic colleagues mocked it. They called it unscholarly, poetic, unserious. And Nietzsche did not care, because he was no longer writing for academics. He was writing for those who could still feel the will to power stirring inside them, for those who had not yet been fully domesticated, for those who could still hear the call to become.
But almost no one was listening. His books sold poorly. He resigned from his position at Basel due to chronic illness, migraines so severe he would go blind for hours, nausea that left him bedridden for days, insomnia that stretched into weeks. His body was failing, and yet his mind was on fire. He kept writing. He kept refining his vision. He kept articulating the idea that would define his philosophy, the will to power. Nietzsche did not invent this concept out of thin air. He saw it everywhere, in nature, in history, in himself. The will to power is not a theory, it is an observation. And preferred metaphors for it were that everything alive is trying to grow, that a tree does not just survive, it reaches toward the sun, that a child does not just exist, it wants to run, to climb, to master its body, that an artist does not just create, they pour themselves into their work, trying to externalize something inside them that demands expression. This is the will to power. Not domination, but self-overcoming, the drive to become more than you are, to expand, to evolve, to refuse stagnation. And Nietzsche believed this drive is the fundamental force of existence, that everything, every person, every culture, every value system can be understood through this lens.
Those who embrace their will to power become creators, innovators, artists, philosophers, leaders. Those who deny it become resentful, bitter, small. And those who turn it against themselves, who internalize the belief that strength is evil and weakness is good, become sick, psychologically, spiritually, physically. Nietzsche was living proof of this. His body was failing because his will to power had been suppressed for so long. He had been taught to be good, to be humble, to shrink himself, and his body rebelled. His migraines were not just medical, they were psychological. His insomnia was not just physical, it was existential. His entire nervous system was at war with the moral system that had been imposed on him. And so he wrote Thus Spoke Zarathustra, his most poetic and radical book. In it, he imagined a prophet descending from the mountains to teach humanity a new way of living, not through submission, not through humility, but through self-overcoming, through the will to power, through the creation of new values.
Zarathustra teaches that man is something to be overcome, that you are not the endpoint of evolution, that you are a bridge between the animal and something higher, the Übermensch, the person who has fully embraced their will to power and created themselves without needing the approval of gods or society. But no one understood. The book was a commercial failure. Nietzsche printed only 40 copies of the final part and gave them away to friends, most of whom never responded. He was writing for a future that did not yet exist, for people who had not yet been born, and he knew it, and it devastated him. In 1882, Nietzsche met Lou Salome. She was brilliant, independent, beautiful. He fell in love, deeply, desperately. He proposed a marriage. She refused. He tried again. She refused again. And Nietzsche, who had spent years preaching the will to power, collapsed. His letters to her were pleading, vulnerable, raw. He begged her to reconsider. He offered to change himself, to be what she needed. He abandoned his philosophy in the face of rejection. And Lou Salome chose neither Nietzsche nor his friend Paul Ray, who was also in love with her. She chose her own freedom. And Nietzsche was left alone, heartbroken, humiliated. His will to power had been tested, and he had failed. This is the cost Nietzsche never fully wrote about, that the will to power is not a shield against suffering. It is the thing that makes you suffer more intensely. Because to strive, to grow, to refuse to stay small, this opens you to rejection, failure, heartbreak. The person who does not try cannot fail. The person who does not love cannot be heartbroken. The person who stays small is safe. But Nietzsche believed that safety is death, that to live is to risk, that the will to power demands vulnerability, and that most people choose safety over growth because growth is terrifying. After Lou Salome, Nietzsche retreated. He wandered Europe, living in cheap boarding houses, writing feverishly. He was alone, sick, ignored, and yet he kept writing. He wrote Beyond Good and Evil. He wrote On the Genealogy of Morals. He wrote The Antichrist. He poured everything into his work, his rage, his loneliness, his insight, his will to power, knowing that no one would read it in his lifetime. And then, in January 1889, something broke. Nietzsche was walking through the streets of Turin, Italy, when he saw a horse being beaten by its owner. The horse was exhausted, trembling, unable to pull the cart, and the owner kept beating it. And Nietzsche, who had spent years writing about strength, about overcoming, about the will to power, ran forward, threw his arms around the horse's neck, and collapsed, sobbing. This is the image that haunts Nietzsche's legacy. The philosopher of strength, broken by compassion. The man who preached self-overcoming, overwhelmed by the suffering of a beaten animal. Some say this was the moment his mind shattered. Others say it was simply the moment when the mask fell, when the sensitive, wounded soul beneath all the philosophy was finally exposed. After that day, Nietzsche's mind was gone. He wrote letters signed Dionysus and the Crucified. He declared himself a god.
He spoke in fragments. He no longer recognized his friends. His mother came and took him home, and for the next 11 years, until his death in 1900, he lived in silence. The man who had tried to teach humanity how to become more than human could no longer speak.
His sister, Elizabeth, took control of his work, and she distorted it. She edited his writings to support her own nationalist, anti-Semitic agenda. She turned Nietzsche, who had despised nationalism, who had praised Jewish thinkers, who had spent his life critiquing German culture, into a symbol of German supremacy. The Nazis later adopted him as a philosophical hero, twisting the will to power into a justification for domination and genocide. This was the ultimate betrayal, not just of Nietzsche's work, but of his life. Because the will to power was never about dominating others.
It was about overcoming yourself, about becoming more honest, more creative, more alive, about refusing to let fear, resentment, or weakness define you, about creating meaning in a world that offers none. But the world misunderstood, and Nietzsche died without knowing that his ideas would be used to justify the very things he had spent his life opposing. So, what is the will to power, really? It is not aggression. It is not violence. It is not the desire to dominate others. It is the drive to grow, to expand, to become, to take the suffering, the failure, the heartbreak, and transform it into something meaningful, into art, into philosophy, into a life that is fully lived, fully felt, fully your own. Nietzsche believed that this drive is suppressed in most people, that society, religion, morality, they all conspire to make you small, to teach you that wanting more is greedy, that striving is selfish, that power is evil. And so you learn to hate your own strength. You learn to call your weakness virtue. You learn to resent those who dare to grow while you stay stagnant. And this resentment, Nietzsche said, is the poison of modern life.
It is what he called resentment, the deep, festering hatred that weak people feel toward the strong, not because the strong have harmed them, but because the strong remind them of what they could have been, but chose not to become. You have felt this. You have resented someone for succeeding where you failed, for being confident where you are insecure, for daring to be fully themselves while you hide. And instead of using that resentment as fuel, as a sign that your will to power is staring, you turned it into moral judgment. You called them arrogant. You called them selfish. You told yourself they were bad and you were good. And in doing so, you stayed small.
Nietzsche is asking you to stop, to see the resentment for what it is, a sign that you have been denying your own will to power, that you have been taught to fear your own strength, that you have been living a life that is not yours. But here is the hard truth. Embracing the will to power is not comfortable. It is not safe. It does not lead to peace. It leads to conflict, to risk, to failure, to heartbreak. Because to grow is to outgrow. To become is to leave behind the person you were. To create is to destroy what no longer serves you.
Nietzsche lived this. He outgrew his academic career. He outgrew his friendships. He outgrew his love for Lou Salome. He outgrew his health, his sanity, his life. And in the end, he died alone, misunderstood, his work twisted into something he would have despised. But he also lived more fully than most people ever will. He wrote books that changed the world. He articulated ideas that still resonate more than a century later. He refused to shrink. He refused to be domesticated. He refused to call his weakness virtue. And even though his life ended in collapse, even though his mind shattered, even though he was betrayed by those closest to him, he became.
He overcame. He lived his will to power until there was nothing left.
And this is what Nietzsche offers. Not a method for success, not a guarantee of happiness, not a promise that embracing your will to power will make life easier, but the recognition that you are alive, and to be alive is to grow or to rot. There is no middle ground. You either expand or you shrink. You either become or you decay. You either embrace your will to power or you spend your life resenting those who do. So ask yourself, what are you afraid to become? What strength are you suppressing? What power are you denying because you've been taught it's dangerous? What part of you wants to grow, but you keep calling it selfish, arrogant, too much?
Nietzsche cannot give you permission. Only you can. But he can show you what you've been taught to fear. That inside you is a force that does not want to be still, that wants to create, that wants to overcome, that wants to become more than you are, and that this force is not evil. It is life itself. The will to power is not about dominating others. It is about becoming yourself, fully, unapologetically, without shrinking to make others comfortable, without calling your weakness virtue, without resenting those who dare to be strong. And yes, it is lonely. Yes, it is risky. Yes, you will fail. Yes, you will be misunderstood. Yes, you might collapse like Nietzsche did, broken by your own intensity.
But the alternative is worse. The alternative is living a life that is not yours. A life spent shrinking, a life spent resenting, a life spent calling your fear goodness while hating yourself for being weak. Nietzsche chose the fire, and it consumed him, but it also forged him into something that still burns, still speaks, still challenges everyone who encounters his work. He did not survive, but he became, and that becoming is what matters. The will to power is calling, not to dominate, but to grow, not to harm, but to create, not to take from others, but to become more yourself.
And the only question is, will you answer, or will you keep pretending that staying small is somehow noble? Nietzsche is gone, his mind shattered, his work distorted, his life ended in silence, but his voice remains, and it is still asking, what will you do with your one wild, short, irreplaceable life? Will you shrink, or will you become? The choice has always been yours, and it always will be. And if you want more philosophy that refuses to let you stay small, Jung's anima, Freud's unconscious, Sartre's bad faith, the shadow you refuse to see, subscribe. This is Heart's Country. We don't tell you to be comfortable. We tell you to become. Together.